Welcome back, gang, for round 2 in our Chapter 9 lecture series. This section is entitled Market Society. The focus question for this section is, how did the market revolution spark social change? A significant change in the northern economy was the transformation from an emphasis on self-sufficient independent farmers to commercial farmers, ever more connected and dependent upon networks of national and international commerce. The North transformed into an integrated economy of commercial farms and manufacturing cities. Farmers increasingly focused on growing crops or raising livestock for sale while using the proceeds from those sales to consume manufactured retail goods. The invention of the steel plow and the mechanical reaper, two very important time and labor saving devices, increase agricultural output exponentially. And growing cities, those hubs for business and commerce, became a market for these goods and a source of credit as banks quickly developed in these urban areas to facilitate the commerce of the region and the cities involved. Speaking of the growth of cities, particularly in the north, that stood at the crossroads of interregional trade, those node points where the transportation networks converged, grew tremendously at this time as the economic opportunities afforded within those cities attracted more and more people to them. Urban life was transformed as entrepreneurs looked to maximize profits while keeping labor costs down. There was a decline in independent artisans and craftsmen, which were generally more expensive, and a growth of workshops, which featured a division of labor. They broke down the manufacturing process into steps and areas of specific specialization and assigned each of those steps to different workers, creating a new system of manufacturers that had a new emphasis on unskilled waged labor rather than skilled artisans and craftspeople that could create a manufactured good themselves from start to finish in a highly specialized and skilled way. Increasingly, there was more and more emphasis on making the manufacturing process faster and cheaper. Market forces compelled employers to intensify the speed of production and minimize labor costs in order for them to maximize their profitability. This increasing emphasis on a division of labor led to the development of the factory system in the United States. The factory system gathered large groups of workers together under central supervision and replaced hand tools with power-driven machinery. All of these things which greatly reduced the amount of skill necessary to produce a manufactured good. It also decreased the cost of producing that manufactured good as well. Along with this factory system, developed a theory called the American System of Manufactures, which featured the mass production of manufactured goods using interchangeable parts and the standardization of finished products. No longer were manufactured goods considered somewhat works of art produced by independent craftsmen with their hands, with hand tools, where each manufactured good was somewhat unique in its own right. now with this American system of manufacturers, there was standardization across the board. All manufactured goods were more or less the same across the board. A like item was a like item. And this also further increased the profitability while decreasing the cost involved in manufacturing these items. The early Industrial Revolution was mostly confined to New England, however. It spread slower outside of that core New England territory, even in the North. But the South, however, continued to focus almost exclusively on cotton production, ignoring industrial development, and again, like I mentioned before, further increasing the economic, social, and, as we shall see, political divide between North and South in the 19th century. The market revolution and factory system slowly began to change Americans' conception of time itself. Clocks, not seasons, began to more and more regulate work and leisure time. Prior to this, there was no clear separation or division between work and leisure time, as there was no need for a specific set schedule, and people generally worked based on their own economic needs and personal inclinations. But this growing and increasing emphasis on unskilled wage labor by the hour made scheduling more and more important to American industry and the American worker. Closely supervised work tending a machine for a period determined by a clock, however, seemed to violate American freedom and independence to many Americans of the time. And because of this, native-born men, those most wedded to those ideals of freedom and independence, generally avoided these sorts of jobs. So employers had to look to other groups who lacked alternative ways of making a living to fill those positions. And these included immigrants, but also women and children as well. Textile mills in New England was the first industry that relied heavily on female and child labor. Now, the women who generally were hired to work in these mills were poor, unmarried women who it was feared might otherwise be corrupted by society and perhaps fall into less reputable professions like, say, prostitution or the like. Owners of these mills set up boarding houses with strict rules regulating personal behavior. Women workers were still expected to maintain high moral standards expected of women at the time. This was the first time that large numbers of women left their homes to participate in wider public life. Now, most of these women worked for a few years before getting married and settling in to the lifestyle of a married woman of the age. The demand for labor posed by the industrialization of the North was met by increased immigration during this time. The majority of immigrants were from Germany and Ireland and generally moved to northern states where they wouldn't have to compete with slave labor. This further increased that divide between North and South as these immigrants into the North further democratized and pluralized Northern society and culture, while the society and culture of the South remained very insular and not influenced by outside forces that were brought in by immigration. Now, these immigrants from Germany and Ireland were pushed out of Europe in general due to mechanization and industrialization in those regions, and they were aided in their immigration by improved ocean travel thanks to things like the steamboat. The largest number of immigrants during this period came from Ireland, where the Irish were fleeing the Great Famine that lasted from 1845 to 1851. A famine of the potato crops, which was at the time Ireland's primary food crop and made up the majority of the diet of the Irish at the time, faced a blight that killed off the majority of the crop, leading to mass starvation and suffering in Ireland, which killed millions of Irish and led many, many more to immigrate out of Ireland, seeking to escape this famine. They filled in the United States unskilled and low-wage jobs while living in overcrowded and unsafe urban ghettos. On the other hand, many German immigrants moved west, where they farmed and engaged in craft production. Unlike the Irish, the Germans had a much larger skill set in which they could apply in the American economy and establish their own economic independence and success. The result was the creation of a vibrant German language culture, as entire communities of Germans would establish themselves in western areas in Pennsylvania and Indiana, Ohio, and other western territories at the time. And in fact, in a lot of these towns that they established, German was the primary language. They had German language newspapers. Most of the business and even local government was conducted in German, and it took a while for the German communities in those regions to fully integrate within the larger American society. The influx of new immigrants in the first half of the 19th century led to the rise of Nativism in the United States. Irish immigrants in particular faced intense hostility, in part because of their Catholic religion. And in many cases, the same stereotypes that were applied to blacks were applied to Irish. We've been talking about this phenomenon throughout this course, going back all the way to the colonial period. This idea of the Irish as a less civilized people and their equation with the black population throughout the early period of American history. People generally feared that Catholicism itself threatened American freedom, and the influx of these Irish immigrants was a reflection of that threat. Nativists in general blamed immigrants for crime and other issues in growing cities, while also fearing that immigrants were taking their jobs and undercutting their wages. Sound a little familiar, folks? Things like that have been argued throughout American history regarding immigration. And just to show how vitriolic some of this nativist sentiment could be, this lithograph right here actually illustrates a riot that occurred in Philadelphia in 1844 between nativists and Irish immigrants into that city. So, and these sorts of riots and things like that occurred in many cities, especially in the North, where the Irish had established a presence. Corporations became central to this new emerging market economy. Under the corporate structure, investors and directors were not personally liable for the company's debts. Therefore, corporations could raise far more capital because there was much less risk involved. The courts and the legal structures generally upheld the validity of corporations and the corporate business structure and affirmed employers' full authority over the workplace, essentially removing government from the workplace and making these corporations and businesses essentially a law unto themselves when it came to dealing directly with their labor force. Government generally fully supported industry and commerce through the legal system and removed as many roadblocks as it could from the development and advancement of commerce and industry. Now, all of these changes and legal structures greatly benefited owners and investors at the expense of workers and the common American. That concludes part 2 of our Chapter 9 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.